Okay. Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Bedtime Stories with Kaybe. I hope the fire isn't too loud. Um, so before we begin, because this is the first episode, I want to take a brief moment to explain what it is we're going to be doing here. Now, if you're familiar with my other streams, this is going to be quite different. Every other stream I've done so far has been a gaming stream. Where we've played various video games, and those streams are certainly not going anywhere. They will remain the bread and butter of this channel. However, this is a special series that I very much have wanted to do, and that is to share some wonderful stories with you all. So today, we are going to begin reading through my book of Grimm's fairy tales. I don't know if we'll necessarily commit to the entire book, but this is why I have chosen Grimm's fairy tales, as they are short stories that we can knock one or two out in a stream very easily and leave nothing left unsaid. If this series proves to be popular, then I hope to move on from Grimm's fairy tales to other stories, chapter books, longer stories that we do not read in a single stream, such as the Wizard of Oz novels, Alice in Wonderland, some H.G. Wells science fiction, maybe some Jules Verne. I'm not as familiar with Verne as I am with H.G. Wells, but yes. So, if you watch this in the future and enjoy the content and want to see more, I strongly recommend that you leave recommendations for not videos, but books or short stories that we should read on the channel. Obviously, the requirements are such that the work has to be in the public domain, or you need to be the author able to give me permission to read it on the stream. So we're going to begin with Grimm's fairy tales. I should also provide a content warning. These are the original versions of the Grimm's fairy tales, which we are going to read, which means there is content in these stories that you might not expect in a children's story were it being written and published originally today. So if you are deciding to use some of these the stories in this series to listen to with your children, I suggest that you either listen to them first or are prepared to use these stories as springboards for conversation, or are just aware of whatever particularities are in whichever particular story we are reading that night. This will be a weekly series. We shall start. My plan right now is to do it every Friday night at about this time. I may shift an hour earlier once I return to work. We'll see. For now, I intend to read two stories tonight. They're both just a few pages long. And that is The Frog Prince, firstly, and then The Young Giant afterwards. Let us begin. Let me take a sip of my water before we begin. My invisible water. All right. The Frog Prince. Long ago, when wishes often came true, there lived a king whose daughters were all handsome, but the youngest was so beautiful that the sun himself, who has seen everything, was bemused every time he shone over her because of her beauty. Near the royal castle there was a great dark wood, and in the wood, under an old linden tree, was a well. And when the day was hot, the king's daughter used to go forth into the wood and sit by the brink of the cool well. And if the time seemed long, she would take out a golden ball and throw it up and catch it again. This was her favorite pastime. Now it happened one day that the golden ball, instead of falling back into the maiden's little hand, which had sent it aloft, dropped to the ground near the edge of the well and rolled in. The king's daughter followed it with her eyes as it sank, but the well was deep, so deep that the bottom could not be seen. Then she began to weep, and she wept and wept as if she could never be comforted. And in the midst of her weeping, she heard a voice saying to her, "What ails you, king's daughter? Your tears would melt the heart of a stone." And when she looked to see where the voice came from, there was nothing but a frog stretching his thick, ugly head out of the water. "Oh, is it you, old waddler?" she said. "I weep because my golden ball has fallen into the well." "Never mind, do not weep," said the frog. "I can help you. But what will you give me if I fetch your ball again?" "Whatever you like, dear frog," she said. "Any of my clothes, my pearls and jewels, or even the golden crown that I wear." "Your clothes, your pearls and jewels, and your golden crown are not for me," answered the frog. "But if you would love me, and have me for your companion and playfellow, and let me sit by you at table, and eat from your plate, and drink from your cup, and sleep in your little bed, if you would promise all this, then I would dive below the water, and fetch you your golden ball again." "Oh, yes," she answered, "I will promise it all, whatever you want, if you will only get my ball again." But she thought to herself, "What nonsense he talks! As if he could do anything but sit in the water and croak with the other frogs, or could possibly be anyone's companion." But the frog, as soon as he heard her promise, drew his head under the water and sank down out of sight. But after a while, he came to the surface again with the ball in his mouth, and he threw it on the grass. The king's daughter was overjoyed to see her pretty plaything again, and she caught it up and ran off with it. "Stop, stop!" cried the frog. "Take me up too. I cannot run as fast as you." But it was of no use, for croak, croak, after her as he might, she would not listen to him, but made haste home, and very soon forgot all about the poor frog, and had to betake himself to his well again. The next day, when the king's daughter was sitting at table, with the king and all the court, and eating from her golden plate, there came something pitter-patter up the marble stairs. And then there came a knocking at the door, and a voice crying, "Youngest king's daughter, let me in!" And she got up, and she ran to see who it could be. But when she opened the door, there was the frog, sitting outside. Then she shut the door hastily and went back to her seat, feeling very uneasy. The king noticed how quickly her heart was beating, and said, "My child, what are you afraid of? Is there a giant standing at the door, ready to carry you away?" "Oh, no," she answered, "no giant, but a horrid frog." "What does the frog want?" asked the king. "Oh, dear father, when I was sitting by the well yesterday and playing with my golden ball, it fell into the water, and while I was crying for the loss of it, the frog came and got it out for me on condition that I would let him be my companion. But I never thought that he could leave the water and come after me. But now there he is outside the door, and he wants to come in to me." And then they all heard the knocking a second time, and crying, "Youngest king's daughter, open to me. By the well water, what promised you me, youngest king's daughter, now open to me." "That which thou hast promised, must thou perform," said the king. "So go now, and let him in." So she went and opened the door, and the frog hopped in, following at her heels, till till she reached her chair. Then he stopped and cried, "Lift me up to sit by you." But she delayed doing so until the king ordered her. When once the frog was on the chair, he wanted to get on the table, and there he sat and said, "Now push your golden plate a little nearer, so that we may eat together." And so she did. But everyone might see how unwilling she was, and the frog feasted heartily. But every morsel seemed to stick in her throat. "I've had enough now," said the frog at last, "and as I am tired, you must carry me to your room, and make ready your silken bed, and we will lie down and go to sleep." Then the king's daughter began to weep, and was afraid of the cold frog, and that nothing would satisfy him but he must sleep in her pretty clean bed. Now the king grew angry with her, and said, "That which thou hast promised in thy time of necessity must thou now perform." So she picked up the frog with her finger and thumb, carried him upstairs, and put him in a corner, where she had lain down to sleep. He came creeping up, saying, "I am tired and want to sleep as much as you. Take me up, or I will tell your father." Then she felt beside herself with rage. Picking him up, she threw him with all her strength against the wall, crying, "Now will you be quiet, you horrid frog?" But as he fell, he ceased to be a frog, and he became all at once a prince with beautiful kind eyes. And it came to pass that with her father's consent they became bride and bridegroom. And he told her how a wicked witch had bound him by her spells, and how no one but she alone could have released him, and that the two would go together to his father's kingdom. And there came to the door a carriage drawn by 8 white horses, with white plumes on their heads, and with golden harness. And behind the carriage was standing faithful Henry, the servant of the young prince. Now faithful Henry had suffered such care and pain when his master was turned into a frog, that he had been obliged to wear 3 iron bands over his heart, to keep it from breaking with trouble and anxiety. When the carriage started to take the prince to his kingdom, and faithful Henry had helped them both in, he got up behind, and was full of joy at his master's deliverance. And when they had gone a part of the way, the prince heard the sound at the back of the carriage, as if something had broken, and he turned round and cried, "Henry, the wheel must be breaking." But Henry answered, "The wheel does not break, 'tis the band round my heart, that to lessen its ache, when I grieved for your sake, I bound round my heart." Again and yet again there was the same sound, and the prince thought it must be the wheel breaking. But it was the breaking of the other bands from faithful Henry's heart, because he was so relieved and happy. And that is the end of this original version of The Frog Prince. I shall now take a moment to take a sip from my water. If you are watching the recording, feel free to pause the video. If you are ready, we will now read our second story of the evening, The Young Giant. This one is slightly longer. Let us begin. The Young Giant. A long time ago, a countryman had a son who was as big as a thumb, and he did not become any bigger, and during several years did not grow 1 hair's breadth. Once, when the father was going out to plough, the little one said, "Father, may I go out with thee?" "Thou wouldst go out with me," said the father. "Stay here, thou wilt be of no use out there. Besides, thou mightest get lost." Then Thumbling began to cry, and for the sake of peace his father put him in his pocket and took him with him. When he was outside in the field, he took him out again and set him in the freshly cut furrow. While he was there, a great giant came over the hill. "Dost thou see that great monster?" said the father, for he wanted to frighten the little fellow to make him good. "He is coming to fetch thee." The giant, however, had scarcely taken 2 steps with his long legs before he was in the furrow. He took up little Thumbling carefully with 2 fingers, examined him, and without saying one word went away with him. His father stood by, but could not utter a sound for terror, and he thought nothing else but that his child was lost, and that as long as he lived he should never set eyes upon him again. The giant, however, carried him home, suckled him, and the Thumbling grew and became tall and strong after the manner of giants. When 2 years had passed, the old giant took him into the forest, wanted to try him, and said, "Pull up a stick for thyself." Then the boy, who was already so strong that he tore up a young tree out of the earth by its roots, but the giant thought, "We must do better than that," took him back again and suckled him 2 years longer. When he tried again, his strength had increased so much that he could tear an old tree out of the ground. That was still not enough for the giant. He again suckled him for 2 years. And when he went with him into the forest and said, "Now, tear up a proper stick for me," the boy tore up the strongest oak from the earth, so that it split, and that it was a mere trifle to him. "Now that will do," said the giant. "Thou art perfect," and took him back to the field from whence he had brought him. His father was there, following the plough. The young giant went up to him and said, "Does my father see what a fine man his son has grown into?" The farmer was alarmed, and said, "No, thou art not my son. I don't want thee. Leave me." "Truly I am your son. Allow me to do your work. I can plough as well as you, nay, better." "No, no, thou art not my son, and thou canst not plough. Go away." However, as he was afraid of this great man, he left hold of the plough, stepped back, and stood at one side of the piece of land. Then the youth took the plough, and just pressed it with one hand, but his grasp was so strong that the plough went deep into the earth. The farmer could not bear to see that, and called to him, "If thou art determined to plough, thou must not press so hard on it. It makes bad work." The youth, however, unharnessed the horses, and drew the plough himself, saying, "Just go home, father, and bid my mother make ready a large dish of food, and in the meantime I will go over the field." Then the farmer went home, and ordered his wife to prepare the food, but the youth ploughed the field, which was 2 acres large, quite alone. And then he harnessed himself to the harrow, and harrowed the whole of the land, using 2 harrows at once. When he had done it, he went into the forest and pulled up 2 oak trees, laid them across his shoulders, and hung one harrow on them behind and one before, and also one horse behind and one before, and carried all of it as if it had been a bundle of straw to his parents' house. When he entered the yard, his mother did not recognize him, and asked, "Who is that horrible tall man?" The farmer said, "That is our son." She said, "No, that cannot be our son. We never had such a tall one. Ours was a little thing." She called to him, "Go away! We do not want thee." The youth was silent, but led his horses to the stable, gave them oats and hay, and all that they wanted. When he had done this, he went into the parlor, sat down on the bench, and said, "Mother, now I should like something to eat. Will it be soon ready?" Then she said yes, and brought 2 immense dishes full of food, which would have been enough to satisfy herself and her husband for a week. The youth, however, ate the whole of it himself, and asked if she had nothing more to set before him. "No," she replied, "that is all we have. But that was only a taste. I must have more." She did not dare oppose him, and went and put a huge cauldron full of food on the fire, and when it was ready carried it in. At length come a few crumbs, said he, and ate all there was. But it was still not sufficient to appease his appetite. Then he said, Father, I see well that with thee I shall never have food enough. If thou wilt get me an iron staff which is strong, and which I cannot break against my knees, I will go out into the world. The farmer was glad, put his 2 horses in his cart, and fetched from the smith a staff so large and thick that the 2 horses could only just bring it away. The youth laid it across his knees, and snap! He broke it in 2 in the middle, like a bean-stick, and threw it away. The father then harnessed 4 horses, and brought a bar which was so long and thick that the 4 horses could only just drag it. The son snapped this also in twain against his knees, threw it away, and said, Father, this can be of no use to me. Thou must harness more horses, and bring a stronger staff. So the father harnessed 8 horses, and brought one which was so long and thick that the 8 horses could only just carry it. When the son took it in his hand, he broke a bit from the top of it also, and said, Father, I see that thou wilt not be able to produce me any such staff as I want. I will remain no longer with thee. So he went away, and gave out that he was a smith's apprentice. He arrived at a village, wherein lived a smith, who was a greedy fellow, who never did a kindness to anyone, but wanted everything for himself. The youth went into the smithy with him, and asked if he needed a journeyman. Yes, said the smith, and looked at him and thought, That is a strong fellow who will strike out well and earn his bread. So he asked, How much wages dost thou want? I don't want any at all, he replied. Only every fortnight, when the other journeymen are paid, I will give thee 2 blows, and thou must bear them. The miser was heartily satisfied, and thought he would thus save much money. Next morning the strange journeyman was to begin to work. But when the master brought the glowing bar, and the youth struck his first blow, the iron flew asunder, and the anvil sank so deep into the earth that there was no bringing it out again. Then the miser grew angry, and said, Oh, but I can't make any use of thee. Thou strikest far too powerfully. What wilt thou have for the 1 blow? And then he said, I will only give thee quite a small blow, after all. That's all. And he raised his foot, and gave him such a kick that he flew over 4 loads of hay. Then he sought out the thickest iron bar in the smithy for himself, took it as a stick in his hand, and went onwards. When he had walked for some time, he came to a small farm, and asked the bailiff if he did not require a head servant. Yes, said the bailiff, I can make use of one. You look a strong fellow who can do something. How much a year do you want as wages? He again replied that he wanted no wages at all, but that every year he would give him 3 blows, which he must bear. Then the bailiff was satisfied, for he too was a covetous fellow. Next morning, all the servants were to go into the wood, and the others were already up, but the head servant was still in bed. Then one of them called to him, Get up! It is time. We are going into the wood, and thou must go with us. Ah, he said quite roughly and surly, You must just go then. I shall be back again before any of you. Then the others went to the bailiff, and told him that the headman was still lying in bed and would not go into the wood with them. The bailiff said they were to awake him again and tell him to harness the horses. The headman, however, said as before, Just go there. I'll be back again before any of you. And then he stayed in bed 2 hours longer. At length he arose from the feathers, but first he got himself 2 bushels of peas from the loft, made himself some broth with them, ate it at his leisure, and when he was done, went and harnessed the horses, and drove into the wood. Not far from the wood was a ravine, through which he had to pass. So he first drove the horses on, and then stopped them, and went beside the cart, took trees and brushwood, and made a great barricade, so that no horse could get through. When he was entering the wood, the others were just driving out of it with their loaded carts to go home. Then he said to them, "Drive on. I will still get home before you do." He did not drive far into the woods, but at once tore two of the very largest trees of all out of the earth, threw them on his cart, and turned round. When he came to the barricade, the others were still standing there, not able to get through. "Don't you see," said he, "that if you had stayed with me, you would have got home just as quickly, and would have had another hour's sleep?" He now wanted to drive on, but his horses could not work their way through, so he unharnessed them, laid them at the top of the cart, took the shafts in his own hands, and drew it over. And he did this just as easily as if it had been laden with feathers. When he was over, he said to the others, "There, you see, I have gotten over quicker than you," and drove on, and the others had to stay where they were. In the yard, however, he took a tree in his hand, showed it to the bailiff, and said, "Isn't that a fine bundle of wood?" Then said the bailiff to his wife, "The servant is a good one. If he does sleep long, he is still home before the others." So he served the bailiff a year, and when that was over, and the other servants were getting their wages, he said it was time for him to have his too. The bailiff, however, was afraid of the blows which he was to receive, and earnestly entreated him to excuse him from having them. For rather than that, he himself would be head servant, and the youth should be bailiff. "No," he said, "I will not be a bailiff. I am a head servant, and will remain so. But I will administer that which we agreed on." The bailiff was willing to give him whatsoever he demanded, but it was of no use. The head servant said no to everything. Then the bailiff did not know what to do, and begged for a fortnight's delay, for he wanted to find some way to escape. The head servant consented to this delay. The bailiff summoned all his clerks together, and they were to think the matter over and give him advice. The clerks pondered for a long time, but at last said that no one was sure of his life with the head servant, for he could kill a man as easily as a midge, and that the bailiff ought to make him get into the well and clean it, and then when he was down below, they would roll up one of the millstones which was lying there, and throw it on his head, so that he would never return to daylight. The advice pleased the bailiff, and the head servant was quite willing to go down the well. When he was standing down at the bottom, they rolled down the largest millstone, and thought they had broken his skull. But he cried, "Chase away those hens from the well. They are scratching in the sand up there and throwing the grains into my eyes so that I can't see." So the bailiff cried, "Shush, shush," and pretended to frighten the hens away. When the head servant had finished his work, he climbed up and said, "Just look what a beautiful necktie I have on," and behold, it was the millstone which he was wearing around his neck. The head servant now wanted to take his reward, but the bailiff again begged for a fortnight's delay. The clerks met together and advised him to send the head servant to the haunted mill to grind corn by night, for from thence no man had ever returned in the morning alive. The proposal pleased the bailiff. He called the head servant that very evening, and ordered him to take 8 bushels of corn to the mill, and grind it that night, for it was wanted. So the head servant went to the loft, and put 2 bushels in his right pocket, and 2 in his left, and took 4 in a wallet, half on his back, and half on his breast, and then laden went to the haunted mill. The miller told him that he could grind there very well by day, but not by night, for the mill was haunted, and that up to the present time whomever had gone into it at night had been found in the morning lying dead inside. He said, "I will manage it. Just you go away to bed." Then he went into the mill and poured out the corn. About 11 o'clock, he went into the miller's room and sat down on the bench. When he had sat there a while, the door suddenly opened, and a large table came in. And on the table, wine and roasted meats placed themselves, and such good food besides. But everything came of itself, for no one was there to carry it. After this, the chairs pushed themselves up, but no people came, until all at once he beheld fingers which handled knives and forks and laid food on the plates, but with this exception he saw nothing. As he was hungry, and he saw the food here, he too placed himself at the table, and ate with those who were eating, and enjoyed it. When he had had enough, and the others also had quite emptied their dishes, he distinctly heard all the candles being suddenly snuffed out, and as it was now pitch dark, he felt something like a box on the ear. Then he said, "If anything of that kind comes again, I shall strike out in return." And when he had received a second box on the ear, he too struck out. And so it continued the whole night. He took nothing without returning it, but repaid everything with interest, and he did not lay about him in vain. At daybreak, however, everything ceased. When the miller had got up, he wanted to look after him, and wondered if he were still alive. Then the youth said, "I have eaten my fill, but received some boxes on the ear, but I have given some in return." The miller rejoiced and said that the mill was now released from the spell, and wanted to give him much money as a reward. But he said, "Money I will not have. I have enough of it." So he took his meal on his back, went home, and told the bailiff that he had done what he had been told to do, and would now have the reward agreed upon. When the bailiff heard that, he was seriously alarmed and quite beside himself. He walked backwards and forwards in the room, and drops of perspiration ran down from his forehead. And then he opened the window to get some fresh air, but before he was aware, the head servant had given him such a kick, he flew out the window into the air, and so far away that no one ever saw him again. Then said the head servant to the bailiff's wife, "If he does not come back, thou must take the other blow." She cried, "No, no, I cannot bear it," and opened the other window because drops of perspiration were running down her forehead. Then he gave her such a kick that she too flew out, and as she was lighter, she went much higher than her husband. Her husband cried, "Do come to me," but she replied, "Come thou to me, I cannot come to thee." They hovered about there in the air, and could not get to each other. And whether they are still hovering about or not, I do not know. But the young giant took up his iron bar, and went on his way. And that is the end of the story of the young giant. Thank you for listening. This is the end of the first episode of Bedtime Stories with Kaybe. Next time, we will read more stories from Grimm's fairy tales. The next story will be Tom Thumb. That will be next week at the same time. Thank you for listening, and I wish everyone a good night. Pleasant dreams.